I have a canvas that I use to paint on when I want to experiment without worrying about ruining a nice, new, clean canvas. I started wondering recently how many paintings must be underneath there altogether, and that led me to the idea that I would do one painting a day for 10 days in a row on the same canvas and document it here for you. I like to use cardboard a lot when I'm painting. Sometimes I paint right on it, which can be another good way for me to get over the fear of a blank canvas, but mostly I use it as a palette. Initially, the cardboard will absorb some of the paint, especially if you're using a water-based paint, so to get around that you could cover it with some plastic wrap. Also, if you paint right on the cardboard, you will have to peel the paint off before you recycle the cardboard, but once the paint's dry, that's easy enough to do. For this exercise, I decided to time box myself to 1 hour per painting. Time boxing really helps me when I'm practicing drawing, so I figured I'd give it a shot with painting. I'm not using a reference image for this one, I just kind of started with colors I liked and made a gradient starting lighter at the top of the canvas and then darker closer to the horizon line to imply that there's some kind of mountains or shrubbery way off in the distance to help give it some depth. My attempt at a shoreline here flattened out the image quite a bit, I think, which was not my intention, but given my time limit, I just kind of went with it. I added a little boat and a house, and trying to limit my color palette, I used a blue for the roof that I already had in parts of the land. And then, with only a little bit of time left, I decided that there would be a foreground. I again used the colors that I already had on my palette from the background to put some flowers and swirlies right up front. It definitely gave the painting more of a whimsical vibe, so I added a little moon and some birds and called it a day. I don't think I liked this painting very much when I first finished it, which is why I'm covering it here before cleaning up. Looking back though, I think it's actually one of my favorites out of all 10, and this is a really good example of why it's so important to step away from your work frequently and come back later with fresh eyes. With this painting, I knew exactly which colors I wanted to make up my background, which is why I'm applying paint directly to the canvas. I did use a bit too much though, so I wiped a lot of the white off and put it on my palette to use later. I used so much white, so it definitely did not get wasted. This is another seascape, but this time I wanted to focus more on water and waves without having to worry about how they interact with land. I find it really inspiring how some artists can give the indication of waves and depth without going into any detail at all. That's sort of what I was going for here, and as you can see I ended up redoing the water a number of different ways, but I couldn't quite get the impression I was going for. Nevertheless, I added my little sailboats, which in hindsight should not have been pure white. I think if I had mixed a little bit of blue in on some of the sails to show some shadow, that would have ended up looking a lot less flat. But I still like the piece, so with my last few minutes I painted the outside edges of the canvas black to provide a nice frame. This is probably my least favorite painting ever. The best part of it is the background that you're seeing right now, which I'm about to cover with a horrible muted gray, brown-green color. I paint a lot of forest scenes, so I went into this pretty confident, but I went way too fast, especially with the background. I usually spend about 3 to 4 hours on a forest painting, so being time boxed really got me in my head, I think, and I only spent about 5 minutes on the background when I should really have spent at least 20 minutes on it. I generally work from background to foreground, so once the crappy background stuff was in there, it really set the tone for the rest of the painting. You can see me try to go back in there now and paint some bushes behind trees that are already there, and it just makes things worse. I tried to channel Bob Ross at the end, but even little doers couldn't save this painting. I think if I had taken a few minutes at the start to plan this out instead of just jumping in and trying to rush to get to the foreground, this would have been a lot better. Also, if I had used literally any other colors, this would have been a lot better. Basically, if this painting was a completely different painting, it would have been a lot better. For everybody involved. Okay, so one of my least favorite things about the last painting was the color. So for this one, I decided to spend my first few minutes mixing and putting some thought into what I wanted my palette to look like. I was enjoying the palette knife, so I used that to apply paint to start my sky gradient. Once I had my background blended out, I started to carve out the horizon and land, and then I realized I didn't like the colors I had mixed, especially the green. I don't hate green in general, I just made a number of consecutive bad choices involving green. So anyways, I used the palette knife to implement some subtractive techniques, and here we are, sans green. This was kind of a cool effect, but I wasn't sure how to build on it, so I blended it out and removed some of the excess paint with paper towel. A lot of people have told me that they could never paint because they make too many mistakes and paint is so uncompromising and you can't erase something once you make a mark. And hopefully what I'm demonstrating here is that you absolutely can erase something. You can wipe it off, you can scrape it off, you can wash it off with a little soap and water, or as long as you're working with acrylics, you can just wait 10 minutes for it to dry and paint right over it, as many times as you want. I find acrylic paint to be super forgiving in that regard. It can get a bit expensive, but there's a really wide range of acrylic paint quality, and you can always start with the cheapest and work your way up from there as you become more comfortable. I found that really inexpensive acrylic paint can often be pretty thin and watery in consistency, but you can always add some kind of thickening agent. Even something like cornstarch would work fine, I think, especially if you're just learning. If you ever had an art teacher, they've probably told you that being an artist is much less about your ability to render and much more about your ability to be a creative problem solver. And that's definitely something I believe. A huge goal of mine as an artist is to be able to paint and draw people. I think every poem I've ever written is about or inspired by a person. So although painting landscapes and seascapes can be fun for me, I think my paintings would feel a lot more impactful and meaningful to me if I found a way to incorporate people having people-y experiences. So for this painting, I'm using a reference photo and I'm treating it as a study. The photo I'm using is of myself, as I was not comfortable publicly messing up anyone's face but my own. I also decided to do the study in grayscale to really try to focus on shapes and shade rather than color. You'll see here that I really managed to flatten out the face and even warp the image so that I'm looking more straightforward rather than up and to the right like I am in the photo. Also, the mouth I've painted takes up about 30% of the width of the face, whereas in my reference photo you can see that it should take up more like 70%. Another thing I'm noticing here is that in the photo I'm kind of hunched over, and in my painting it really looks like I'm just sitting up straight. These aren't things I noticed at the time, but I'm finding it really helpful to be able to look back and see where the biggest mistakes are. While I was painting, I definitely could tell that something or multiple things were off about it, but being able to look back at the entire process with fresh eyes really helps me pinpoint what I plan to do differently next time. At this point, I had about 15 minutes left and I was starting to feel a bit defeated with the self-portrait, so I added some details around the figure to try to help distract from it. Even though I didn't nail the last one, I really enjoyed using a reference photo, so I wanted to try that again with some color. I just found this photo on Unsplash, and I'll tag the photographer here. The initial shape that I block out for the vase is way too big, but I do resize it as I'm adding color to my background, and I correct the shape a little bit. This painting ended up being much less of a photo study and more of just an inspired by the photo piece. I decided there should be a window here, but that went horribly, so I incorporated these colors back into the background and pretended it never happened. I think I could have stopped here, but I had a bit more time, so I did some experimenting around the edges of the canvas. I'm not really sure when this was done, but I figure this is as good a place to call it as any. After that, I get a bit carried away with the paper towel and whatnot. I actually think this could have been really interesting if I went back at this point and sharpened up some of those details of the flower and the vase and added some saturation back into the focal point. But I was out of time, so that's an idea for next time. I was, for some reason or another, compelled to retry the forest speed painting. The first thing I did differently was make sure to use colors that were a bit more vibrant. I also spent a little more time creating depth in my background by trying to indicate some bushes and trees way off in the distance. I don't love these muted greens that seem to be resurfacing. I think I must have been mixing green with black, which is absolutely not the call, so I'm not sure why I did that twice. I think mixing dark green with a really dark blue would have given me a much better result. I think it would have been better to spend even more time on the background and on the trees rather than trying to add a bridge here at the last minute, but I still think this is a big improvement from my last attempt. Also, fun fact I learned on the Bob Ross Wikipedia, he actually does 3 of each of the paintings we see on his show, one to plan it out and use as a reference during filming, the second one is the one that we see, and then the third one he does after filming with a bit more detail, and that's the one that's photographed for his instructional books. For this one, I went back to the reference photo idea. Again, not a study, just a very loose vibes reference of sorts. I took this photo just by screenshotting a video I took of my friend Cow. Here is part of that video for your viewing pleasure. Cow's legs are not visible in the picture, and my plan was to have flowers covering the bottom half of the piece, but I didn't want him to be without legs until then, so I added these in just for the meantime. I think the time boxing really helped me with this one, as it's not something I would normally try to do. Painting a cow sounds pretty intimidating, but when I go into it with the expectation that it's going to be quick and probably not very good, I feel a lot more comfortable using weird colors and exaggerated proportions. This one felt like I was just getting to play for an hour, and I had a lot of fun with it. I'm not sure how productive this was in terms of making me a better artist, but it did make me a happier person that day. Okay, so I lost some footage here, which is not ideal, but you didn't miss much. It's just another seascape, but this time I focused a lot on making the sky really colorful and then trying to reflect some of that in the land. Again, not very exciting, but it did get done. I really had absolutely no plan for this one. I just started by putting colors on a surface. I don't know. I was reminded of an art teacher I had who always told us to talk to our paint and listen to it. I don't take that too literally, but it does feel good sometimes just to move a brush around intuitively. I moved it around a little too much maybe, which got rid of any interesting colors I might have had going on in the background, but I decided it was a good enough place to start. I don't really love how this last piece turned out. I think I could have really benefited from a reference photo here for these flowers, but I made something, and that always feels good. Not only did I make something, I also finished something. There are 10 paintings on this canvas. There are actually way more than 10, but the last 10 have been documented, and I did them each in under an hour just like I set out to do. My goal was not to make good art, my goal was simply to make art, and here we are, little swirlies and all. You can tell I'm really not feeling optimistic about my work when I start using the little swirlies and aggressively wiping things with paper towel. So yeah, I don't think I would call this a strong finish, but it is a finish, and overall I really enjoyed this project. Plus, it's really good to remind yourself from time to time that making art can be as high or as low pressure as you want it to be. Paint on cardboard, or on rocks, or on yourself. Paint on old canvas that has 10 paintings buried underneath it. And use whatever you have available or whatever you can afford. It doesn't have to be fancy or expensive. I often find it actually helps if it isn't fancy and expensive. I think it's a lot easier to express yourself and to explore in a space where you're not worried about making a mess or wasting material because you aren't happy with the quality of your work yet. You've heard it 100 times, but the only way to get better is by doing. You can watch videos or read books about it all day, but if you don't have an outlet where you feel comfortable to make bad art, then you won't be able to improve upon it either. If you don't do the thing, then there's nothing to improve. And I obviously have a lot to improve upon, so please take from this only what feels relevant to you. Here are some of my favorite paintings that came out of this. And here are a few of the things that I'm going to try to remember moving forward from this project. Tune in next time to watch me attempt to peel back the many, many layers of paint from this canvas and see how many of the old paintings I can uncover. Spoiler alert, it goes really well.